right, good morning. I don't know if you read the title of this talk. If the blind lead the blind, and you know the rest. It's Matthew 15:14. If the blind lead the blind, both shall fall into a ditch. Now, I've heard this many times, this one line, and so yesterday I was working on this, I pulled out my Bible and I thought, there's got to be more to the story. And it's a very interesting story. It's about the scribes and the Pharisees when they went to Jerusalem to meet Jesus. And they asked Jesus, "Your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders. Why do they do this? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." You know, in the Bible days, there were a lot of rules on what you can and should not do and what you should eat and not eat. And there was this great pressure to always wash your hands a lot of times, but especially when you're going to eat. And the Pharisees and religious leaders put a lot of importance on this, so it became very easy for them to think, if I'm obeying the rules, I'm really good with God, no matter what I do otherwise. So their actions were often far away from God. So when asked why his disciples did not wash their hands before eating bread, Jesus said, "Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your traditions? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and he who curses your father or mother should be put to death." Now, there was no response in the Bible. I imagine there was no response at that time either. But Jesus said this attitude of the scribes and the Pharisees was an example of the blind leading the blind. So if our focus today is on an outward expression of our religion, and yet at the same time that we care more about what other people think of us, then we're blind. And whoever is following us is blind. And together we'll end up in a ditch, or at least somewhere not very pleasant. But it was a warning to be careful of who we blindly follow. Now, in the Science of Mind philosophy, we propose that we continually put our trust in God. I call God infinite intelligence, whatever word you use for God. And this isn't to minimize the importance of spiritual leaders, like Sue and I, the practitioners, our whole organization of ministers, and it's not to minimize that, because we try to be good spiritual role models. We try to help show a way of kindness, of openness, of love and compassion. But it's important to think occasionally about what spiritual beliefs we put in our mind and test them out. Test them out. Because we don't want to blindly follow somebody down a path just because that person says I'm right. Now, in Matthew 23, Jesus called out the Pharisees and the scribes 5 times, and he was not very nice about it. He said they make astute arguments, but they are perverse in their actions, and that they have a blindness in their heart that's overtaken them. The Pharisees, this is an interesting part to me, the Pharisees, in order to get good with God, would place their gifts on the altar. And mint, the herb mint that you use in salads, that was one of those things that the Pharisees would take to the temple and place on the altar. But they would do it very scrupulously. They would weigh out the leaves of the mint on a scale and only put so many on the altar. And while Jesus said it was right to weigh mint carefully, at the same time, these people neglected things as mercy, faith, and love. Jesus described the Pharisees as being like a man who poured a drink through a strainer to be sure there were no bugs in it, but then they go out and eat a whole camel, hair, hoofs, and all. Yeah, it's an analogy, of course, but it's really kind of gross. And that's exactly how Jesus meant it to be. He then criticized the Pharisees because they would carefully wash all the cooking crockery, all the plates and the pans and everything that they made food on, but they would not think twice about the food that they got through fraud. He said they were indifferent and essentially blind to the essential morality of their acts and thoughts. Man, I'd hate to be a Pharisee hearing all this. But Jesus was a really wise man, and many of his sayings apply to us today. In preparing for this, I was looking about blind leading the blind and blind spots. I Googled blind spots, and I was reading that in psychological analysis, it's believed that when a therapist is analyzing a patient and they find that this patient has a deep-seated hatred for their father, if the therapist has the same deep-seated hatred, they should just stop right there, because the blind would be leading the blind. I was amazed years ago when I went to an eye doctor, and it might have happened to you too, and they pick up this little wand with this dot and they move it around until you can't see it, it disappears. That's your real blind spot. And I thought, this is crazy. Am I going blind? He said, no, we all have this little blind spot. And really what happens in us emotionally is if we have a significant emotional event and it doesn't get healed, it creates an emotional blind spot. We can't clearly think through things when that emotional event comes back up if it hasn't been healed. And Jesus understood this. And you might know someone who is very intelligent, and then they do something or say something, and you go, wait a minute, this person's really intelligent. How could they believe that? How could they do that? It makes no common sense. And I've always been mystified by that. But reading about blind spots, if we could uncover that person's whole emotional life, we would probably find where they had an emotional event around that, and they can't see through it. They can't think straight on that one issue. Now, I have an example, and I have to tell you up front, this talk healed something in me that happened years ago. My first husband, I got married at 19 and was married 21 years. He came from Germany with his whole family when he was 10. He was extremely smart. My husband was the smartest person I ever met. But when it came to communicating with people every day, he would often say things that hurt their feelings. And I just couldn't figure that out. But he had this emotional bias that when he knew something was right, it had to be right for everybody. And he better tell them. It didn't take long to realize that this trait was rampant in his whole family. They were very outspoken about what was right. And in a family situation, they would ridicule each other if somebody did something that was not right. And they would all laugh about it. Even when the relatives came from Canada and they would have a big family gathering, it was who's right and who did something stupid that was obviously wrong. And I thought their need to be right was greater than their need to be compassionate. That was me at the time. And so I became a great observer. I never took offense at anything they said. I actually grew up as a kind of spaced cadet teenager. I didn't know a lot about the world, so I was learning from them. But what I understood when I reflect back on that is they originally lived in Latvia. And when the Russians were coming, they found their way to Germany. And those stories are horrific, just in and of themselves. And then they were in Germany during World War II. And you know, if you didn't do the simplest things right, you were in great danger, great danger. But I I say all that because it, it was interesting to watch and observe, but I was in the family now. I was a daughter-in-law. And after a while, I noticed that whenever I was with the family, they would always talk about the other daughter-in-law, my husband's brother's wife, Sandy. Sandy did this, and Sandy did that, and Sandy's just an amazing person. And they would never ask me about me. And so what I got in the habit with is when somebody would pause, I would say, well, you know what I did? I'm blah, 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 blah. And they would look at me and go right back to their conversation. It was mystifying to me. I didn't understand it. But finally, I had the nerve to talk to Sandy. And I said, you know, Sandy, every time I'm with the in-laws, all they talk about is you. And she said, what? Every time I'm with the in-laws, all they talk about is you. I said, what? And that was a great revelation. And so, as why am I going to tear up about this? I just figured it out. They didn't want to say anything to me, to ridicule me, to criticize me, because I chose their son as my husband. So I had to be right. And Sandy had to be right. They were afraid if they told me something I was doing wrong, it would impact my relationship with my husband. So I can look back on that and see the years of toll of trying to stay alive during the war. You had to do it right, or the family might be split apart, or you might be arrested. But I was married 21 years in that family, and I learned to be a great observer. I didn't speak up much. I learned to observe and listen and watch, and this is long before Eckhart Tolle. And you know, I carry that trait today. You know, the other day, Sue and I were talking, and she looked at me and she said, Mary, what do you think? And that's the observer in me. Oh, me? You want to know my opinion? It's very interesting. You know, this kind of blind spot thing happens across the world, especially when it comes to religion. Religious conflicts surface because I'm right and you're wrong. I'm going to heaven and you're going to hell. And it gives people the authority to be intolerant and unkind and criticize people. It plays a trick on our mind. So that's why I'm glad I'm here in religious science and through the philosophy of the science of mind, where we believe in oneness, that it's all one, and that every person is part of that oneness. We've all been created by the one God. You know, in some religions, especially Eastern religions, it's been that way for thousands of years. And in the US, it's still a challenging concept. Now, I really don't think we're wrong about oneness, because my neighbors could say, that's a bunch of bull, but I don't think we're wrong, because it makes sense that there's only one thing going on here. Otherwise, the world would self-destruct. I believe this oneness is full of goodness, of love, of freedom. And when we believe that, we become more tolerant of others. We become more compassionate. We become more loving, because we recognize all of us as a soul are on this evolutionary spiral, this upward spiral. And when we get caught in that spiral, when we find a block in ourselves in that spiral, when we have a blind spot in that spiral, we might find ourselves blindly groping in the dark, searching for answers. I've been there. One article I read about conversational blind spots. Here's a few things you might consider or recognize. I'm sure not in yourself, but maybe in others. Holding the assumptions that others see what we see, feel what we feel, and think what we think. failing to realize that fear and distrust change how we interpret reality. The inability to stand in another person's shoes when we're upset. And here's a good one. Assuming that we remember what other people say when actually we only remember what we think about what other people say. That's why it's unwise for anyone to set themselves up as the example, the great example. Instead, we humbly follow the truth as we see it in our mind. We do it in a good nature. We have tolerance for ourselves and others. And this is how we find our way back to what Ernest Holmes described as the central flame from which every person's life is lighted. In The Science of Mind, Holmes addressed the parable of Matthew 15:14, and he wrote that we must be careful what kind of thoughts we are following. We should test all ideas to see if they're true. It's a mistake to accept everyone's opinion or philosophy just because it sounds plausible. He cautions us to be on guard because the truth is always simple, direct, and self-evident. Now, we're living in an era of fake news. False ideas heaped upon false ideas, and all of a sudden it makes bad matters even worse. So it can be very challenging to discern what's real and what's not, who's telling the truth or not. And for me, the bottom line is I ask myself, do I want to believe them because I just want it to be true? Do I want it to be true because it helps or hurts someone else? That's a big one. Do I want it to be true because it hurts someone else? Good question. And this is very dangerous. Recently, you may have heard the term McCarthyism. It's a term that came out of the 1950s and has since become to mean the defamation of character or reputation by widely publicized indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated. Let me read that again. McCarthyism, defamation of character or reputation by widely publicized indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated charges. And this goes back to the 50s. Senator Joseph McCarthy came to national prominence after he gave his speech, and he claimed to have a list of 205 State Department employees who were members of the Communist Party. Now, after World War II, that was a big deal. He claimed he had this list, and there were 205 employees nested in the State Department who were impacting foreign policy. So finally, in 1954, there were hearings convened. And this was just when the television world opened up. We had this little 8-inch black and white TV that only worked if it was a foot away from the wall looking backwards. But my parents would sit there watching these hearings, and they were televised from gavel to gavel for 57 days. This was a big deal. In the end, all his allegations were fruitless. It contributed to his political downfall, and in 1954, December that year, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to censure him, and it basically eradicated his political influence from there on. So personally, I don't want to be taken in by fake news, so I'm very curious. Every day, ask Paul, I read the Record Searchlight, the Red Bluff Daily News, the Wall Street Journal. I check a few news sites on the internet. I read the Week magazine, because it has various opinions about things. I read Time magazine. I read the Imprimis newsletter. I want to stay on top of it. I want to know what's going on, but I don't want to be brought into fake news and then feel it and then have negative emotions in my life that create how did anyway, it's my curiosity because I want to know what's going on, and by the end of every week when I go through all that, I think I have a clue of what's true. I think I do. But as one individual, I don't have any control over that. I write letters. I write really good letters. They go out into the ethers, I don't know. And in that way, I'm encouraged when people really do work together. I'm really encouraged by it. And at the same time, when politicians don't work together, it can be very discouraging. So I send more letters. So I'm really glad I believe in this science of mind philosophy, our principles and our practices, because we do believe in oneness. We don't believe in duality. Because if we accepted evil as equal to good, what would our life look like? It would be a fight between the darkness and the light. So I encourage you to fully trust in God and know that the light of God's love can be expressed by you out into the greater community and make a difference, because it's the only what's going to happen. Each one of us doing what we can so the world doesn't fall into a ditch. So let's pray about that. First, I'm praying that I made it through that. It was an emotional talk for me. I know that everyone here is a divine creation of the One. I believe it. Your soul knows it. And that we're here for a greater purpose, to not only fulfill the soul's journey of learning to be more love, more happiness, to spread more happiness, more joy, all the good traits of God. We're here to grow in our knowledge of how we all work. Grow in our knowledge of understanding and having compassion for people who have maybe many blind spots, knowing they can overcome those. And the blind spots we each individually have, may we recognize them like I did this week and overcome whatever it is holding me back from sharing my thoughts, my beliefs, my life. So I accept this new knowledge for everyone here and everyone listening. I accept it with the compassion and love that a minister has for all we meet, all we see, all we connect with, especially our families. So I'm grateful. Grateful for this topic, for the new revelation, grateful for your presence, grateful for this whole day. And I release this energy to all of you to be the best you can be. And so it is. Wow.